This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 242, Drush. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our thoughts are with the Drupal community as the world fights COVID-19. On today's show, we have Preston So joining us to talk about the tool we all know and love, Drush. But before we get to that, let's check in with Nick to see how he's doing.
Good morning. So as the last few weeks, this is recorded on a different day and a different time. It's a little bit earlier than
recording we've ever done.
I think so.
The pre-coffee recording.
Absolutely. My dog is very confused. Speaking of dog, I've been doing my part with physical distancing, trying to go shopping only every 10 days or so. But I realized this week that my dog's rabies shot was expiring. So I kind of had to go to the vet. That was that's obviously fairly urgent, medical need for the dog. So I scheduled it for yesterday. It was very different than any vet experience I've ever gone through before. They have you drive up in your car, give them a call, which usually they answer right away. Sometimes they put you on hold, but it was busy. I had to call them 6 times before I got through. And I was a little confused as to why that would happen. Until they came out and took the dog, and they said, okay, we'll give you a call as soon as we get in to do the check-in. So they took my dog, Kitako, in, called me 2 minutes later, and did the usual check-in stuff. Are there any problems? Is he eating well? That kind of stuff. And then the doctor took him, and the doctor called me, asked me some of the same questions, told me what she found, told me that the shot went well. I mean, he's a good dog, so he never has problems with that kind of thing. But that, and then the receptionist called me 5 minutes later to take payment, and then they brought him back out. So, I was there for about a half an hour, most of it waiting for them to pick him up. But, it was pretty efficient, actually. But I also understand now why every time I called, it was busy. Their phones are probably overloaded with their brain.
Would you prefer they stick with this regimen moving forward? It's like a drive-through kind of vet appointment.
Yes and no. It was actually nice because when we're usually in the waiting room, my dog gets very excited about other dogs. So it was nice to have him in the car instead of in the office yapping. It'd be nice to see the doctor face-to-face for any questions that I have. Sure. This is my first dog, so, and he's 4 now, so I still have questions about what's normal, what's not. But, it was nice. It was better than I expected under the circumstances. So it was an experience, that's for sure.
Interesting.
How about you, Steve?
I don't know. This week and last week and the week before seemed to all be blurring together for me.
Absolutely.
Totally consumed with everything that's going on and the changes. I guess the one thing that I don't have any tech stories or tech things that I did this week like I usually do. The thing that jumps out in my mind is when I went to the grocery store, they didn't know there's a 10-day rule. I am totally breaking that.
There's no 10-day rule. That's a personal thing.
Okay, all right.
I haven't gone to the grocery store in 2 weeks, but I'm just, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm going for my parents too, so it's shopping for me. My parents, we got more people in the house now because they're not in school, so I'm spending more on groceries. But when it kind of struck me when the grocery store was counting people and not letting people in when it got to 150. I just thought that was kind of interesting. That day when I was like 134 and I was like, oh, thank God I get in and I don't have to wait outside. Just different environment. But yeah, everything is going well. Do find it a little harder I've never had trouble working at home. Been working at home for 20 years, but it's been a little bit more distracting with the house full. And although everyone's on Zoom doing their thing, just a little bit more distracting for me than usual. How about you, John?
Actually, I have a question for you, Steve, if you don't mind. So I'm wondering from your wife's a teacher. So I'm wondering from a teacher's perspective, how is that going for her being on the opposite side of the homeschooling?
It is really challenging. So it's fascinating to see. So my wife was actually on vacation. Her school has like a college break. They have 2 weeks in March. We were supposed to be in Paris, if you remember. But so she just went back this week. And so there were other schools that had a couple of weeks ahead of them so they could learn a little bit. But I can see how challenging it is. You know how you got 17 kids, you have enough trouble controlling them when they're in a room together and you can see them. Having them on a Zoom, 3 or 4 times a day for an hour and they're doing work on the side is really challenging.
It's interesting. So my son's school doing the same thing, Zoom, and his teacher is actually doing really well with it. Some of the other teachers, you can tell they're struggling shifting their normal teaching environment to that online space, especially with Zoom, because it's they got to get familiar with the tool and that sort of thing. So it's interesting.
Setting expectations is really important.
Sure.
And I think the parents have different expectations. That some parents have expectations that the kids are going to have a full day and they're going to learn just as much as they used to before. And then other parents are like, hey, this is too much for my kids to be online all day. We need to do something a little different. So it's challenging of managing the kids, managing the parents, and the expectations of the school. So the teachers are working hard these days, that's for sure.
Yes, I would agree. And I think, all the parents need to cut them some slack. No pun intended. So for me, yesterday I actually started a new job, which I'm pretty excited about. Don't worry, I'm still at Oomph. I'm just switching teams internally at Oomph. So for the last 6 years, I've been on the engineering team as a senior Drupal architect. But now I am going to be on the newly created business development team and working as an account manager. So pretty excited about that. It's definitely going to be a shift in, skill set for me. But it's going to be fun and I'm looking forward to it. So I think,
Congratulations.
Thank you. What's that?
That's exciting.
It is. It's new. It's different.
It's always awesome to see business development people with engineering backgrounds in our field.
Well, so that's really the thing is that, obviously we do a lot of large technical projects, and to have somebody on the front lines to be able to estimate and speak to those sorts of things is super helpful on both sides. So that was kind of a driver for me to make the move was, I had a lot of support from a lot of my teammates and our leadership team saying like, no, you definitely can do this. This is going to be great for you. And then understanding that like, being able to help the team from a technical standpoint up before the project actually is signed and started working on is going to be a great thing. So super excited about that. But enough about me. Let's talk about our guest. We have with us today, Preston So. Preston is a Drupal architect and developer has been a Drupal architect and developer since 2007 with 13 years of experience in Drupal. He also wrote a book, Decoupled Drupal in Practice, the first and only comprehensive guide to decoupled Drupal across the stack. Currently, he's the senior director of product strategy at Oracle. He's editor-in-chief at Tag One Consulting and host of Tag One's Team Talks webinar series about emerging web technologies. Preston previously led product design and engineering teams at Gatsby, Acquia, and Time Inc. Founder and lead organizer at Drupal at Decoupled. Oh man, let's try that again. Founder and lead organizer at Decoupled Days in New York City, the first and only conference about the future of CMS architectures. Now it is in its 4th year. Wow, congratulations. That's awesome. Preston also has a blog at Preston.so. So we'll have that in the show notes for you. Preston, welcome to the show.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And sorry, by the way, about the early start. I'm generally a very early morning person, and I apologize for the unusual start time for this recording.
Have no fear. My son was up at 5:30 this morning. So I was up early. That doesn't necessarily mean I was conscious, but before we jump into our main topic, we wanted to cover some stories. And the first one, actually the only one in our list, super important story, I think, to everybody, is an article from Dries about sustaining the Drupal Association in uncertain times. So just an overview, the Drupal Association right now is kind of in a tough spot, because their major event of the year is DrupalCon. It's a huge fundraising event. They make a good amount of their annual funding from that event, right? And right now they're in a spot where, well, they can't have it when they originally were going to have it. They may push it out and have it in the future, but it's a little bit uncertain. So the Drupal Association is seeing that shortcoming, and they're asking the community for help. What do you guys think about this article?
I think the thing that was striking was that the disparity and the effect. So one of the things that, they gave actual numbers of what the effect would be, and it's anywhere from $400,000 to $1.1 million. They didn't give a lot of information about why there's such a large spread, although I assume it's due to the fact that the venue and hotels will only cancel if basically government forces them to cancel, like their contract, they're bound by a contract. So I think the lower number is basically a funding gap if DrupalCon doesn't happen, and I think the higher number is the funding gap plus the expenses for all the services that they normally hire that, if they can't cancel them.
Yeah. So I think you're right there. I think it was actually really shocking to me to see that like DrupalCon brought in that much money for them. The high number, I think you said, was 1.1 million or something around that. And, it's interesting because they're at a point right now where, let's see, we just started April. So this is April 2nd. And, force majeure probably doesn't kick in until the beginning of May, maybe, when they have more information as to what the situation is in Minneapolis. So, I imagine, it's going to be a tough scene for them.
So I think next week's show, and I don't know if I've even discussed this with you guys yet, is we're working on having a show about this article and the situation and getting some people in from the Drupal Association on to talk about this in more detail. I think the thing is for people who are using Drupal, every year you're asked to become a member, to donate. I think this is a year where everyone should do something, either large or small, and that maybe that's all it needs to make up this gap. I think maybe this year it's a necessity, even for those who maybe work for a company and the company supports, but maybe personally everyone kind of putting up a little bit. And
we all depend on
a lot of drives, sort of maybe some calls to action and some drives to help make the Drupal Association through this hurdle, as we're all kind of fighting hurdles in our own personal lives and businesses and stuff as well. So it's not just the Drupal Association that people are dealing with today and going to have to help, but people, I believe, are all affected financially by what's going on now.
It's also paving the road for the future. I mean, we're gonna get past this, and on the other side of this, we're all still going to be working with Drupal. And the goal is that on the other side of this, the Drupal Association is at the same level or just as good as it was before this event happened. So I know everybody's trying to look and see how they can help out. So anything anybody can do, they should do it.
Yeah, and it's definitely hard to understate the value the Drupal Association provides. Just given the fact that they handle all of the Drupal.org infrastructure, a colossal undertaking. They offer such community support. So many amazing folks at the Drupal Association who sustain the project. I definitely share the concern about the Drupal Association and DrupalCon. I definitely hope that later this year we'll be able to have a much more kind of strong showing at DrupalCon Barcelona as well, and really show our support, not just in terms of our monetary donations, but also physical presence.
So one thing that I was going to ask, and Preston just reminded me of this, about Drupal Association and what they do. Did anybody else hear yesterday that the Drupal.org has switched to semantic versioning?
Oh, really? That's so exciting.
Yeah. So I saw this article. Let me see if I can find it super quick here. I know I think I shared it with our internal team. And I don't know. I will post it in the show notes right now.
I knew they were working towards that, but I didn't realize that they...
Yeah, so I went to a module page yesterday. Sorry for the color in there, but I went to a module page yesterday, and the module did not have the 8x on it. It literally had 3.0.0-beta-1, and I was like, what? And everybody's like, is this an April Fool's joke? Is this for real? I don't know. So I was wondering if anybody else had heard about it. And based on your reactions, I'm going to go with the no.
So since it's no longer April Fool's, we can actually just go and see if it's still there or not.
All right. Well, we're going to...
There's a post on Drupal.org called Semantic Versioning Model for Drupal. And it was last updated on September 18th, 2018.
So
it describes how they would implement it.
So there's a post from March 31st of this year. And the title is Release Naming Conventions. So let me, you can find it in that link if you click all the way through. So it does look like there are some changes coming to how they're going to number modules, which I think is interesting. And
so it looks like they've set up the infrastructure for it, but modules still have to.
So it's interesting because the reason this is a big deal, right, is because starting with well, you can already do it a little bit in Drupal 8, but starting with Drupal 9, right, modules are going to be able to be used in multiple major versions of Drupal, right? So Nick is, if you're not watching the video, Nick is making a face like he doesn't really believe it, but just stick with me, all right? So the idea is that you could take your Drupal 8 module, you could build it, and if you didn't have any deprecated code in there and you were using all of the right versioning and whatnot, that module would still work for Drupal 9, would still work for Drupal 10, provided all those things were true. So at that point, the need for, labeling the module like 8x, 9x, 10x, whatever is not really necessary anymore. So I don't know. This got me, as you can tell, pretty excited, but Nick's skeptical, and you know what? We can talk about that at some point.
I'll believe it when I see it, I guess.
All right, there it is. All right, let's move on to our primary topic. So, I was first introduced to Drush at Nerd Summit, and I'm sure I've probably told this story before. Steve and I had gone up to Nerd Summit, which is a camp up in Western Massachusetts. And we were sitting in this talk, and I cannot remember who was giving the talk, but I just remember they were talking about Drush.
It was Eric. I think it was Eric Peterson, because I was in the same talk.
No, it wasn't Eric Peterson. It was somebody that used to work at MIT at UMass Amherst. But I cannot remember the gentleman's name. So I'm sitting there and we're learning about this thing called Drush, and I'm like, what does this thing do? And they started using it, and I'm just like, oh my God, this thing is amazing. I'm like, this, you could do all of these cool things. I can build a site, I can clear a cache, I can run cron, all from the command line. It was super easy to set up. I got it set up like right there during that talk. And then from there on out, it was like, I never stopped using it right up until this day. Use Drush all the time. So in February, Preston wrote 2 blog posts on Tag One's website regarding Drush. We mentioned them in previous episodes. We'll put the links to them in the show notes. Drush is an important part of Drupal, and we want to discuss it in more detail today with Preston. A little bit of history. So let's start with some history on Drush. When, Preston, and why did Drush get created?
Sure, it's a great question, and I think it's great to start with a bit of a definition of Drush as well. I know that we've mentioned a couple of aspects of Drush and characteristics of Drush, but I think that beyond just being a command line interface, when you think about Drush and the impact that it has on Drupal development over the last decade or so, it really is an accelerator for Drupal development. All the things you mentioned, John, that you can do with normal Drupal administration, all of those things are possible through Drush. You don't even have to enter the Drupal administrative interface. And these are really important things for developers to be able to interact remotely with their Drupal site. So it's very interesting. The story of Drush is very similar to the story of a lot of contributed experiences and modules and themes to the Drupal ecosystem. It was originally created by a gentleman named Ardo Bendikin, who's a Drupal contributor from many years ago, early versions of the CMS. And he originally put it up as a module available on Drupal.org, just like all of the modules that we have on a regular basis. And in order to use Drush, you would actually install a module to be able to leverage all of these features. Later on, over the course of development and more features added to Drush, Moshe Weitzman, who is a very well-known contributor to Drupal, based in Massachusetts, my old home state, he also started to work on Drush to kind of scratch his own itch. And what was interesting is that this was one of the first times that people had ever seen the potential for this kind of idea of remote Drupal administration without having to touch the interface. And so there was a very favorable reception, a huge amount of popularity. I also use Drush on a nearly daily basis. It's an incredible tool. And a lot of the things that are really key to Drupal development are now part and parcel to this amazing package that we call Drush. The original version of Drush, if you look at Drush 1, Drush 2, Drush 2 was really where this idea of interacting with a remote website began. There's another Drupal contributor from way back in the day who I've met only once in my entire life, and that was Adrian Rousseau, a very early Drupal developer working on Drush. And the first feature that was introduced back then was actually the ability to define site aliases, which is really interesting because if you think about site aliasing, that's an incredibly common feature that many of us use today to target various different local sites that we might have built up. And if you think about that feature as being something that existed at the very beginning of Drush's history, it's a really remarkable kind of story.
Other than kind of the site aliasing, what are the kind of key features existed in the very beginning?
Sure.
I mean, obviously, I imagine clearing cache was one of the first ones that was added. But other than that, what are kind of the things that were around?
It's a very interesting story because, you have this cumulative and gradual addition of more and more incremental features. And this is what really makes Drush's story very interesting is that, you started out with the site aliases, but very few other features were part of the Drush module. And it's really weird to call it the Drush module, because it was the module back in the day. But one of the things that happened was Adrian Rousseau, for example, implemented rsync functionality. So you could do SQL syncs as well as rsyncs, and you could have files and data synced from one Drupal installation to another, which is a very important kind of feature for content synchronization, site staging, all of that sort of thing. But what's very interesting is that Drush 2 also introduced one of the kind of early and possibly the most, I would say, almost like IT support related feature, which is the ability to log in as a user. Drush ULI, surprisingly enough, is one of the earliest available features in Drush and wasn't something that was actually rewritten at all until Drush 9 came along. When Drush 3 emerged, the decision was made by the maintainers, by Mosh and others, to actually switch the nature, the kind of underpinnings of the module away from being a module to being a project external to Drupal. And a lot of people have kind of asked, why is it that Drush is not really part of the Drupal ecosystem as you would find in a lot of other Drupal modules or themes or contributed projects that we know and love in the community? And a lot of that was because, they wanted to create this overarching kind of tool that could encompass all different kinds of Drupal projects, and also to accelerate development, keep on working on it in isolation without necessarily having too much influence from the way Drupal was progressing in its own course. But that's not all. I mean, obviously, as moving into the separate project allowed it to really flourish as a new kind of CLI and its own kind of approach. One of the things that happened in regards to Drupal 4, Drupal 5, that era, was in Drush 5, Greg Anderson, who is one of the key contributors to Drush, actually created what's called output formatters. And output formatters allow you to basically take different responses that come out of Drush and recast them into other formats. And one of the interesting examples of this is actually the Drush PM list command, which we use all the time to look at our list of installed modules. But it's actually formatted. If you look at the terminal, when you actually execute this command, it's actually a really nicely human readable table that isn't this kind of unreadable JSON or perish the thought of other formats that might be used for this. And one of the things that was interesting about this is that now you could leverage Drush output formatters to generate responses that you could actually put into other kinds of formats for consumption in APIs. You could even put all of this information into an XML document or into a JSON object. And all of this really enables a rich array of functionality that you can imagine for tooling on top of a Drupal site. Drush 8, which was really the first version of Drush that was intended for Drupal 8 sites, was a really interesting release because it was the very first time that there was a great amount of synchronization between the development happening in Drupal core and the development happening in Drush. And the fact that people like Alex Pott, who were core Drupal 8 contributors, actually worked with the Drush team to make sure that there was feature parity with a lot of the new features introduced in Drupal 8. One of the interesting things about Drupal 8, obviously, is the new configuration subsystem and all of the configuration management tooling that's available in Drupal. And you can also do all of those things in Drush with the config export, config import, config get, config set, all of these commands that are available. And I actually use these commands quite often when I manage different Drupal sites. And just because of how complex configuration is as a concept, the Drush maintainers felt that it was extremely important to include this functionality out of the box in Drush 8 in order to make sure that anyone coming from either side wouldn't be too confused by these new configuration options.
I honestly think that that's probably the most valuable feature of Drush at this point, other than being able to, like ULI, being able to log into a local site without knowing passwords. I mean, I cannot imagine maintaining a modern Drupal 8 site through the UI with configuration management. That just would be a nightmare, I think. So yeah, I think that's probably my most used feature at the moment.
Yeah,
You mentioned a few of the people that have been involved in the project. Who have been the key contributors over time?
that's a really great question. As I mentioned earlier, the original creator was Ardo Bendekin, who is Ardo, A-R-T-O, on Drupal.org, one of the earliest contributors to Drupal. I know that he still pokes his head around from time to time in the community. I don't know exactly what he's up to these days. Obviously, we also had Adrian Rousseau, another well-known early Drupal contributor who worked on Drush. There were also people who worked on auxiliary tools or kind of ancillary tools that relied on Drush. One example of this is the wonderkind Dmitry Gaskin back in the day, who created Drush Make and also worked a little bit on Drush as well, I believe. But the two kind of core maintainers today of Drush who are still involved in the project, have been since the very beginning, ever since Drush 2, are really Moshe Weitzman and Greg Anderson, who are extremely well known for all of their contributions to the Drush ecosystem, as well as to just the ways in which remote administration happens in Drupal in general. And as a result, I think that these four key folks, when you look at Ardo Bendekin, Adrian Rousseau, Moshe Weitzman, Greg Anderson, these four have really created this this incredible tooling on top of Drupal that everyone uses. I mean, I don't know of another tool within Drupal except with the possible exception of Composer or Twig, right? That's been created and has such an influence on the way we interact with Drupal on a daily basis. It's an incredible story, I think, about how exactly we've been able to foster this open source innovation and really inspire other projects. I mean, if you look at the way that Drush has really developed over the years, it's inspired all sorts of other projects in other PHP ecosystems when it comes to other CMS ecosystems. You look at Drupal console, for example, which is inspired by a lot of the features that Drush has. It has an incredible and storied legacy within the Drupal community. And as an aspirational Drupal historian, I think it's an incredible story that has to be told in its own chapter in the annals of Drupal history.
See a new book coming. I'm just saying.
Oh. The history of Drupal.
The Drupal history, the definitive Drupal history by Preston So. Preston, how did you get involved with Drush?
It's a very good question. I don't actually work on Drush. I don't contribute much to Drush. My interest stems from being very interested in Drush. I first got into Drush when I was building Drupal 7 sites way back in the day, about 10 to 12 years ago, when, originally one of the things that was always a big issue for the large number of sites that I managed back in the agency I worked in Colorado was just the fact that we always had to go in and do these really quick administration tasks that would take any number of clicks on a regular Drupal site if you're going through the user interface. But in Drush would be you could just batch commands and do all sorts of operations on all these different sites all at once. And that was an incredible experience. The first time I really used Drush and I recognized that it's not just a Drush, it's not just about the Drupal site itself. It's really about orchestrating Drupal sites as well. But my interest has come about solely because, I find Drush to be a very interesting tool. I've been looking at ways to start to look at how we preserve Drupal's history a little more. I've been trying to do a little bit more work to look at, we've got all of these great projects that have been gracing the Drupal ecosystem for so many years, and a lot of them have fallen by the wayside or been incorporated into core and no longer have their stories as these kind of separate myths that can be told. And so my interest in Drush is partially as a practitioner using Drush, but also because I'm really interested in how Drush has followed along with the course of Drupal and the journey of Drupal over the course of all these years. It's an incredible story. And if you think about the fact that Drush was never in Dries Buythat's vision for Drupal in the beginning, it really points to the value that this community provides and harkens back, of course, to how important it is that we sustain the Drupal Association and the Drupal project.
This episode is sponsored by Oomph. Do you have a topic you need to know about? Do you need some help with planning a project? Or are you looking for some training about web accessibility? Drupal site building, project management, or an analytics? If so, Oomp's training and consulting services can help your team develop and enhance core competencies that serve to optimize your organization's digital strategies. From packaged training programs to highly customized workshops, Oomph can help your team reach higher level of excellence. Oomph would love to help your training and consulting needs. Learn more about Oomph's training and consulting services at oomphinc.com/training. Thank you, Oomph.
Thank you. So I have a question. How important do you think Drush was to the adoption of the widespread adoption of Drupal?
That's a really good question, Nick. I think it's really hard to ascribe any sort of change in the user adoption or change in developer adoption when it comes to Drupal and assign that responsibility to Drush or that kind of origination to Drush. However, based on what I see as Drush is really I see Drush as really being the nexus of all of the developer interactions with Drupal. At least in the early versions and the sort of early years of Drupal being something that incorporated Drush as a kind of semi-official CLI. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about Drush is that it's really that developer's entry point into Drupal. If you know Drush and if you learn Drush as a Drupal developer, you really have everything at your fingertips that you could ever need. And most users who interact with the Drupal site itself, with the UI that's contained there, are really not going to understand this. And so I think it's a very much developer experience oriented sort of tool. But as a result, it's an incredibly important tool. I would say that for the versions that I worked in Drupal, from Drupal 6 onwards, where Drush was an incredibly integral tool, I would say that that was probably the most essential tool that existed in the Drupal developers toolkit. These days, it's changed a lot. Obviously, I think that there's a lot of growth when it comes to what I would call developer, well, you could call it DevOps, but I don't really like to call it DevOps, but command line interfaces in general that buttress all of these interactions with tools. The sad thing I think about Drush in some senses is that it's kind of fallen a little bit by the wayside because of the growth and innovation seen by a lot of these other ecosystems. Have Composer as an additional CLI to handle dependencies. These are all things that oftentimes you would have handled through Drush. You also have other alternatives. You also have now emerging ecosystems that are becoming part and parcel to Drupal sites everywhere, but are not integrated in any way with the kind of Drush CLI. And one example of this is like NPM, for example, or if you're using front end dev tooling like Gulp or Grunt or some of these tools, you're really starting to look at, well, what actual area does Drush have control over? It's the actual site operations, all of this. But when it comes to things like front-end dependencies or other dependencies, PHP dependencies, it's not as much of an important tool. And I think that these days, Drush in particular, in terms of its importance, has maybe gone, sort of shrunk a little bit, but it's still an incredibly integral part of Drupal's history and also an integral part of how we manage sites anyways. However, of course, with just all the things that are happening around things like Kubernetes and all of these new solutions that are coming out, I think that the importance of Drush as an orchestration tool has certainly started to decrease somewhat. As a site administration tool, as a remote Drupal admin tool, I think it's still very much an important and essential facet of our daily workflows.
Well, we're big fans of Lando on this show, and DDev and tools like that don't exist without Drush. Right? Really, what they're doing is the Drush commands for you in a lot of sense, and it's a layer built on top of Drush. But those things really don't happen in a smooth way like they do without Drush being there.
Absolutely, it's so true. And you think about how much Drush as a tool has smoothed or really flattened a lot of the barriers to doing very quick development of sites and doing these tasks that normally, as Nick mentioned, right, the configuration interface is incredibly difficult to understand for anyone who's not very, very deeply rooted in a lot of the terminology we use in Drupal. And I think that the fact that we offer these options for developers to do this in a much more fast way is an incredible testament to how useful it is and how important it is.
One of my favorite things is to chain together the in Lando the command to composer install Drush cache clear and then Drush config import all together. Go get a coffee, come back. Hey, my site's there. Awesome. So I can definitely understand that. So we've talked about Drush not being in Drupal core, right? It's kind of its own thing floating out there that everybody uses. Do you think the thinking behind that and that decision is in the hopes that other systems will adopt it? Obviously, may need to add to it, but would adopt that in their content management system or their platform?
That's a really good question, John. Obviously I can't speak for the Drush team in terms of where their longer term roadmap is and where they're thinking. I do have some insight into how they're thinking about core inclusion. And I know that there's a lot of questions about this roadmap. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion in the Drupal community about including Drush and core. And there's definitely two reasons why they haven't yet. Obviously one is the standpoint of velocity and how they're able to isolate development of Drush out of the kind of confines of how the way that Drupal development and core development occurs in particular can stymie sometimes progress. And that kind of human consideration, that kind of maintainer consideration is definitely a part of their thinking. I know that. I think the other reason though is that there's definitely an argument that many people have made in favor of is adding Drush to core, adding something that is only useful to a very small subset of the Drupal site audience. If you're including an additional amount of weight or baggage in Drupal's file size or in its overall volume, how much marginal benefit do you get over what is already in Drupal from not only the dev standpoint, because obviously for developers it's very useful, but what happens if you have a Drupal site that's just being maintained by site builders, isn't really being maintained by developers? That's a very different consideration. And so I think that's an example of where people have been very cautious about whether or not to include Drush and core. And this actually really harkens back to a lot of discussions around what Drupal actually, who Drupal is for. Is Drupal for developers? Is Drupal for site builders? Is it for casual users? And still complicating this further, of course, is the fact that Drupal 8 now has two CLI commands available in it itself that are not related to Drush at all. The site install and quick start commands. So you already have developer tools that are now part of Drupal core that don't have anything to do with Drush at all. And it's an interesting kind of discussion right now. There's an active discussion about including a version of Drush in core. I think it's a very important discussion. And there's also a really big opportunity, I think, for Drush to serve other purposes as well. Now that there's a single unified starter template for Drupal projects to set up an initial Drupal site, you can actually, declare Drush 10 as a dependency and then leverage that automatically within your sites as you get started building them. And this actually means that this kind of hypothetical or theoretical Drush and core would actually encompass a lot of things that are not just about site administration, but also encompass a lot of the tasks that have become more and more complex over the years and have involved much more infrastructural considerations and orchestration considerations, not just from the standpoint of a single site and a single environment. But that being said, I think that other systems adopting Drush, I definitely think that other systems have already adopted Drush in terms of the sense of the Drush philosophy. We want to enable this kind of RPC-like experience for Drush that is really, or for our systems, that is really, really similar to the way Drush does things. However, I think that the fact that Drush is very tightly integrated with Drupal, very tightly coupled to Drupal. There's not an equivalent of a config system in WordPress that I know of. There's not an equivalent of let's say, Cache Clear and Laravel that I know of. I'm not necessarily sure that other systems can adopt it, let's say, wholesale, kind of just forklifting it over. But I definitely see a lot of systems having adopted the philosophy behind Drush and the ideas behind Drush in terms of its core approach to how people manage sites.
So as a follow-up to that, quickly, if you were really, really into Drush and you wanted to, help maintain it, or you did want to add, a Drush command to it, how would you go about doing that?
It's a great question. So drush.org is the official website for Drush, and all Drush development actually happens on GitHub. And I think a lot of, there's been obviously a lot of debate about whether or not, we should be moving to GitHub or not, or having projects on GitHub. And I know that they really enjoy they prefer to use GitHub because of how usable GitHub is and how great it is for source management. The GitHub repository is at github.com/drush-ops/drush, And obviously, there's a lot of pull requests open already, a lot of issues open already. And if you want to get involved, I would definitely go there first. When it comes to actually discussing with more of the folks who are working with Drupal, working with Drush, if you want to reach out to folks about Drush, I know that they are all sitting in Drupal Slack as well. And I think there is a Drush channel. Let me just confirm that right now. I'm not sure that there is. There probably should be if there isn't. Okay, there isn't one, but I know that they are very welcoming to new contributors and definitely want to have more folks involved. So that's definitely the way to contribute to Drush. And I think the other part of the question was if someone wants to get involved maintaining, right? I definitely would reach out to folks like Moshe Weitzman and Greg Anderson. I know that they're very responsive on Drupal.org and on Twitter, and can definitely help with getting new contributors started.
One of my favorite parts of Drush.org is the plans and pricing for Drush. Don't worry, everybody. Drush is completely free, even up to the premium plan. So have no fear.
That's a great joke.
Steven's
so
I'm sorry I was muted. So I get 2 things to edit so far, both caused by me.
I don't know. You could probably edit Preston's intro a little bit.
So over the years, Drush moving up to versions has mostly been transparent to me. Drush upgrades, I don't even know it. No change to me. And that didn't happen in Drupal 9. So when Drush went to Drupal 9, I think it's the first time I recognized that some things had changed. And reading your article, I see that Drush was completely rewritten in version 9. I'm wondering, I know you're not in the engineering team. I'm wondering if you have any understanding of the reasons for the rewrite and what that means moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, Stephen, great question. So, I think that, Drush has evolved quite a bit over the course of time, and Drush 9 was probably the most significant overhaul. There were several overhauls in Drush's history. Obviously, you had one overhaul that came from Franz Heinzmann, who redesigned all of Drush for Drupal 5. But the thing that's interesting about Drush 9 is that this was the first time that they completely rewrote and completely rebuilt Drush from scratch. It hadn't actually been substantially refactored in its totality since Drush 3, if you think about way back in the day. And so one of the things that really influenced their decision-making in terms of moving Drush to this new state was, number one, Composer. Composer being introduced in Drupal 8 really made certain Drush commands somewhat redundant, or made certain Drush commands kind of have this weird gray area where it wasn't really certain how, let's say, a Drush en command or a Drush PM install command would necessarily relate to, let's say, composer require or some of these other very common composer commands that we now have. And I think a lot of this has been borne out by the fact that composer is really a great way to handle PHP dependencies and should be the way that we handle those dependencies. And Drush was really about handling Drupal dependencies. It wasn't really about handling all PHP dependencies in general. But the thing that is most important, I think, is that not only was it about really moving Drush into a composer-ready kind of state, and I think that's partially because there was a lot of confusion about how Drush was going to evolve after Drupal 8 really was released. Nowadays, I think that there's a lot of improvements that have happened as well in regards to the actual internal developer experience. As we know with Drush, you can add arbitrary commands, you can add custom commands to any sort of installation of Drush. But the thing that's interesting is that now in Drush 9, for the first time, in previous versions, you had to write all Drush commands in PHP. You had to write everything using kind of the Drush native API, which could be really confusing, especially if you're coming from different PHP ecosystems. If you're coming from different ecosystems altogether, where you're not writing PHP. The interesting thing that they introduced with Drush 9 is the ability to actually write Drush commands and writing new Drush commands as Doxygen, so that you're actually not writing full code. You're actually writing this kind of pseudocode that turns into a command that can then be leveraged. And this is a really new kind of thing because previously you had to write everything by scratch in PHP. The final reason, I would say the third reason why Drush 9 had to be a complete overhaul was because, when the folks on the core team said, hey, we got to introduce configuration options into Drush, and that was, obviously the work that the core maintainers introduced, the sheer introduction of all these new commands, like config split, all of these different kind of important commands, and also the introduction of commands that had been sequestered in other contributed modules. One example of this is the devel generate command, right? They incorporated so many new commands that a lot of the discussion centered around, well, we're already putting in so much new functionality and we're taking a lot of it out. We're really changing the way Drush looks. Why not change the way it works as well? And so I think that the level of innovation that happened over the last couple of years in Drush, and also the adoption of certain features that they took from Drupal console, for example. One of the things that Drush introduced into its own CLI that it adopted from Drupal console was the ability to scaffold a Drupal site in kind of this yeoman style approach. And as a result, all of these things that are improvements really kind of led the maintainers to say, well, hey, we're already refactoring the feature set and the functionality available in Drush. Let's just refactor the whole thing from the bottom up.
So just a question there. Does the rewrite of Drush 9 coincide with the rewrite of Drupal 8?
It's a good question, John. I actually am not 100% sure. I was not following to be completely honest, I was following Drupal 8 development much more closely than Drush 9 development. And I'm not sure, but I'll get that answer for you.
Cool. Maybe we could put that in the book.
Yeah. The New York Times bestseller. Yeah.
So there's one feature of Drush that I miss immensely. I understand why it's not part of Drush anymore, but for some of my older clients, when I first started out with Drupal, the websites that I worked on were much simpler. A lot of them maybe had 2 modules in Drupal 7 and three pages, 4 pages, very, very simple. I still want to keep them secure and updated, but they don't necessarily have a budget to pay me to maintain that every month. Drush had a command where you could update only security releases with the security only flag. And I just really miss that ability. I mean, there's certainly ways you can kind of finagle that with Composer. I found the security reporting from Drupal.org to Composer to be lacking a bit. But instead of looking backwards at kind of what I miss, what's something new coming in Drush 10 that I can look forward to?
Absolutely. So Drush 10 has, and I think this is a case where, and I think about what you just said, Nick, and in some ways, Drush has become almost even more developer oriented, right? It's really interesting to think about the fact that doing all of these security updates back in the day was this easy. And now you're thinking about, now you have all of this complexity in terms of applying security updates and responding to the security advisories. It's really a different world. There's a lot of different things that have been added to Drush now with Drush 10. As I mentioned earlier, you've got the config split and all the configuration options now available. And you can also do a lot of things that are now possible with Drupal 8.8 when it comes to configuration. Drupal 8.8, for example, now has the exclude and transform APIs when it comes to configuration. I've never used those myself personally, but I know that they were very, very strongly requested features. And they also removed a lot of the old code and the cruft that was there. That's the other thing that I forgot to mention in the sort of previous question. The other thing that is really great about Drush 10 is that there's now this really great level of not integration, but level of cohabitability with Composer, right? I think back when we were all building kind of Drupal 8 beta sites or Drupal 8 sites, really in the early days, it was really hard to know kind of, how using a Drush command might change the way that Composer could work or vice versa. And now I think with the full amount of testing they've done, with the huge amount of work they've done to really vet how Drush works with Composer, it's a solved problem. That being said, for me personally, the biggest feature that I'm excited for in Drush 10 is just the fact that it's faster. I've heard that it's incredibly faster, and a lot of that is because it just has taken out a lot of the old APIs that were there that are no longer used.
It's interesting. Nick just brought me back because I kind of forgot that you used to install and update modules you still install modules via Drush, but you used to update modules via Drush. I was like, what's he talking? And then I was like, oh, right. Composer hasn't always been a thing. Right. So thank you. Thank you, Nick, for that walk down memory lane.
Blast from the past.
And in the vein of things I miss PMI, Drush PMI, to get info on a particular module. So you can now use Composer and do Composer show -a. Doesn't tell you if it's enabled or not.
It doesn't. That is true. It just tells you versions and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that's fair. That's fair. Wasn't it PML? PMI. All right.
Yeah.
Moving on. So we've been talking about Drush. Drush is obviously the main topic of the show. You mentioned Drupal console a little bit. Can you kind of give us a high-level overview of what the differences are between Drush and Drupal console and why somebody might use one over the other?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to I'm in the unique position where, and I think we all are in the unique position where a lot of us know Moshe Weitzman, the creator, the New Englander maintainer of Drush. And we also know Jesus Olivas, who is the maintainer of Drupal console. And so having that personal connection changes things a lot for me, because it makes it a little harder for me to talk about how one is better than the other, because they're actually both really awesome projects that have a lot of interesting inspiration that can be offered to a whole lot of other projects. That is a very common question, though, and I think especially for those who are newer to the Drupal ecosystem or who are a little bit less experienced with how the Drupal community works, it's really unclear. Do you use Drush? Do you use Drupal console? And I think that's influencing some of the discussion about introducing Drush into core. So there's kind of interesting similarities and differences between Drupal console and Drush. Drupal console and Drush obviously both share a common foundation. They both rely on the Symfony console component in Symfony. And but there's a lot of differences as well. I think there's it's not just the fact they're both CLIs; they actually do very different things. Commands, the list of commands that are available, the catalog of commands that you have access to in each of those two projects is very different. Drush nowadays, as I mentioned earlier, is using more and more of the Doxygen annotation style of writing commands. Whereas Drupal console really leverages Symfony console much more deeply. It's not really a difference that's from the CLI's perspective. It's more from the developer experience perspective internally, but it's still salient to call out. The other thing that's really different about them is just they have different purposes. And Drupal console is much more focused on doing things that are really important to developer kind of onboarding or starting up, like scaffolding a Drupal site, doing all the kind of site, all the things that you need to do that are kind of like running, like getting started with Drupal, but aren't necessarily things that are about running Drupal. And that's where I think one of the small differences lies, is that Drush, I would consider to be much more about kind of running an active Drupal site and constantly having it going and managing it, whereas Drupal console is really about, well, I need to put this Drupal site into this dev environment or here, and I need to make sure that it's scaffolded correctly and has X, Y, and Z in that whole kind of space. They also differ in terms of testing. There's if you're interested in contributing to either Drupal console or Drush, that's something to call out. There's differences in how they conduct testing. And there's also one final difference that I will call out, which is that I've looked and I've watched and I've seen that Drupal console has seen a little bit less prolific contribution activity lately, especially in the last year or two. Whereas Drush, still sees a lot of active development. And so if you're interested in things like maintainability, that's also a consideration that's important for people who are looking to adopt Drush or Drupal console.
Yeah, so I know a lot of people use Drupal console to do, like, as you said, scaffolding, right? So they're starting a module. There's a command in Drupal console that allows you to basically scaffold out a module for Drupal, right? Drush doesn't have a feature like that currently, right? Is that accurate?
Yes, it doesn't. And I think that that's one of the ways in which, these two projects have very differing, let's say, surface areas. Because, scaffolding out the initial architecture, the initial directory structure of a module is an incredibly important task for anyone building custom modules. Drush obviously doesn't really do that. I think that's partially because scaffolding is not necessarily part of its, MO, but definitely still an important thing. And there's definitely instances where I've seen people kind of use both in a single project, which I think is very scary to me, just because I can imagine typing out instead of Drush, accidentally typing Drupal or things like that. So I think there are dangers, but generally speaking, I think that if you're doing a lot of heavy-duty Drupal development, if you're building a lot of custom modules, if you're spinning up a lot of custom code, I think Drupal console is a great option. If you're doing a lot of orchestration of Drupal sites, if you're doing a lot of kind of security updates, as Nick mentioned, or if you're doing a lot of module management, dependency management in terms of Drupal contributed projects, I think Drush is still maybe the better experience. But obviously, to each their own. I like both projects. I think they're both great, and they both have contributed a lot of interesting ideas and innovation to the Drupal community.
Well, thank you for joining us. If you have any questions or feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter @TalkingDrupal or email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can always get show updates by signing up to our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And as always, we'd like to thank our patrons, Aaron, Chris, Nick, Patrick, Pete, and Saad, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com. Choose Become a Patron. So in closing, Preston, if people wanted to learn more about you or reach out to you, how would they go about doing that?
Sure. I've got a lot of stuff happening at the moment. I think that It's an incredible opportunity to be on the show, and thank you all for this. If you want to check out some of the stuff that I've written about, not about Drush, but about some other topics, if you're interested in decoupled Drupal or headless CMS or some of the other topics that I work with on a regular basis, like voice content or Jamstack architectures, things of that nature, my website is preston.so, and you can find all of my writing at preston.so/writing. Lots of articles that are useful. I also have a big announcement. I'm going to announce this later today, which is probably a week ago now or something in terms of the Talking Drupal timeline. Not sure where we are in medias res, but I'm launching a new monthly newsletter. And if you go to preston.so, you'll see a new newsletter subscription form. It's going to have some exclusive content, things that are not available on my blog and not available in my general speaking engagements or my articles all around the web. This next month is going to have a lot of great material, so please subscribe if you're interested in any of the things that I talk about on a regular basis. Also, my book, Decoupled Drupal in Practice, with a foreword by our project lead of Drupal, Dries Bijtaert, is available on Amazon and Apress in both print and ebook form. Unfortunately, the ebook sale just ended on Apress, but please support the book. And it's still the only comprehensive guide to decoupled Drupal across the stack, and has a great amount of useful information in there. Some of it's a little out of date, but most of it is still perfectly intact. As I mentioned earlier, or as Stephen mentioned earlier, or John, I forget who, mentioned earlier, I also lead a webinar series called Tag One Team Talks over at Tag One Consulting. We do a lot of useful technical webinars, including about Drush 10, over on tagone.com/blog, with a lot of great blog posts related to these topics as well. Finally, and I know this is a lot of shameless plugs, I'm very sorry, but finally, I do lead a conference in New York City. For those of you who are listening from the Northeast United States or all around the world, Decoupled Days 2020 is happening on July 22nd through 23rd. Our early bird ticket sales just ended. We're just about to announce sessions. Follow at Decoupled Days on Twitter, or go to decoupleddays.com, and I will be giving you all a scoop in this Talking Drupal podcast, which is that you are the first to know that Decoupled Days 2020 in New York City is going to be going virtual this year. So it'll be July 22nd, 23rd, virtually on Zoom. We are not going to be holding a conference, and I don't think anyone's really holding a conference this summer in New York City. If you want to reach me, by the way, at Oracle, preston.so@oracle.com. Also at Tag One, preston@tagoneconsulting.com. You can reach me at either of those emails. And of course on Twitter at Preston So.
Preston, thank you so much. And just out of curiosity, you guys are looking for sponsors for Decoupled Days?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We are currently working on kind of revamping our sponsorship packages because, obviously without a physical venue, without some of the in-person things that sponsorships provide, we have to revamp things a little bit. But we are looking for sponsors. We'd be very interested in having more support from folks who are working with Drupal. It's a great conference every year. We have great attendance. We have great speakers. We've had folks from the core teams of Angular, Ember, Gatsby, and a whole lot of other projects come. We had the founder of Netlify last year come and speak. So it's a really, really great time, and highly encourage all of you to come online, socially distanced, on Zoom to Decoupled Days.
Awesome. Thanks again, Preston. Stephen, where can people find you?
Easiest way to get me is on Twitter at Stephen Cross with a PH.
And Nick?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN. And how about you, John?
Yeah, I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. You can find out about Oomph Inc. at oomphinc.com. And in about 5 minutes, you'll be able to find me at my coffee pot in my kitchen. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thanks.
Great. That was excellent. Thank you, Preston.
Oh, man. It's hard
Thanks so much for having me.
It's hard to record a podcast at 7:30 in the morning.
It's really funny because at Tag One, we do this at 7 a.m. every morning. Not every morning, but it's
you guys are
really
clearly operating at a much higher level than I'm capable of at this hour.
Yeah. Well, I'm deeply sorry. It's it's tough because I can't. My general work schedule, and it's because I live in New York City, where I'm trying to avoid rush hour. I'm trying to avoid all of the nastiness of the subway, and just like from 7:30 until 10 a.m. in New York City is just a nightmare. So I generally start work at 7.
Oh wow.
So this is
do you work?
Preston,
do you work?
I do too. So this was like I enjoyed this early start.
Great.
Preston, do you work out of your? I mean, obviously now you work out of your apartment, but does Oracle have? I'm assuming they have offices in New York. Do you work in the offices or? Yeah.
It's I don't know about y'all, but I've been struggling with the whole working from home thing. I mean, working during pandemic is a whole other story. But I've never really liked to work from home. I think a lot of it is that, it's not easy trying to work when you're 6 feet away from your beer fridge and 6 feet away from your sofa. So it's been tough, and it's actually been kind of a problem where, like, yesterday I had a meeting at 2 p.m. and I decided to, crack a can of beer before the meeting. And, it's not easy. It's not easy, but I do have an office. Like, used to go in every day. Sometimes I work at a cafes if I don't have any meetings, but working from home has been really hard. It's going to take a while.
It takes a couple months to get used to it. I mean, so give yourself some time to get into that routine.
Yeah.
Didn't we have a show about working from home recently?
We did.
Which it was actually before all this came up, so I think it was just kind of timely. But we had a show that talked about it. It was pretty interesting to find out how different people coped with working from home. It's definitely a paradigm shift for people used to working in an office, though. It was always the opposite for me, though. When I had a couple clients that would have me come in once or twice a year for a couple of days, and being in an office with 80 people, I found so distracting. Like, I couldn't get anything done because every 2 seconds somebody would be walking by or saying something or on the phone.
All right, Preston, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was fun. Please let me know if I can come on the show again sometime.
Yeah, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.